computer. Well, so we're on our third lecture, and as I was telling Isabel just a little bit ago, when I always say that all history is revisionist history, I just got my new copy of the Smithsonian, where there's a new version of Nero, the new nicer Nero. So people always have different takes on particular historical events, and we sort of judge them on those events, whether we agree with that take or not. So all history tends to be revisionist history. I probably shouldn't have phoned that because I'm going to read it later. I'm sorry. So last time we were talking about the Southern colonies. We talked about slavery and the introduction of slavery and indentured servitudes. And I wanted to get to the New England colonies. And I'm going to share the screen because, you know, Anthony suggested I should have maps, and he's absolutely right. I don't like to say that very often about him, so I'm going to do it now. And so I'm going to share this screen with you about the New England colonies. And so when we talk about New England, I'm just going to shift it over here. This is the area we're talking about. Maine, which was part of Massachusetts until 1820. New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut. That's the New England colonies. And what really is going to divide the New England colonies, and this is important later on as I show you through this map, is right here. This is the Hudson River. This area here is going to be critical during the American Revolution. So is everybody still seeing my map? Let me know, just say yes or no. Somebody?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
okay.
Sorry.
So let's talk about these New England colonies. Now, if you remember in the Southern colonies, we talked about the headright system, right? And the headright system was that if you came over, you got 50 acres of land. That was great. And if you brought somebody of a working age over and a servant, you got an additional 50 acres. They often became indentured servants. Well, the headright system never really takes hold here. What's going to happen in the New England colonies is really essentially groups of like-minded religious people, sometimes churches themselves, will go out and settle together. They'll form townships. What you would do is you, as a group, you would go to the general court and say, hey, we'd like to start our own little mini colony, if you will, our own little town. And so they would grant you land. Now, so you and 50 or 100 of your fellow travelers in terms of religion would get this acreage. Now, what you would do is you would all have your houses pretty close together. Partly that was to protect you from Indian attack. Partly was because these were very religious people, and they had laws saying that you had to attend church. And they also wanted to make sure that everybody was watching everybody else, right? So that they weren't sinning, obviously. Now, not everybody got the same amount of land. It depended upon your social status. So if you were a deacon in the church or you tend to be wealthier, you got a little bit more land, right? That's pretty cool. And the New England laws usually said that if you had, a township of over 50 people, you had a church. I mean, you had to have you had a church, but you also had to have a school for boys, so they could learn to read the Bible. And then they'd have a chunk of land that was always left out for common pasture to everybody to put out their animals. This is known as the commons, right? You still hear that today. If you go to the main park in Boston, Boston Commons is named after the common area where people could actually commonly store their cattle. Now, this is interesting, and I'm shifting a little bit into government here, because in government, and bear with me for a second as I digress here. In government, there's something called political culture. And political culture suggests is the idea of what do you think the role of government is and the role of your politicians in government. And there's a guy named Daniel Elazar, and he had come up with 3 types of political culture. There was what we call the individualistic political culture, where you said government should be only designed to maintain social order and promote business, and favored this rugged individualism that anybody can make on their own. Very limited government, right? Then you had a moralistic political culture, which believed that government was created to promote the general good, the common good, and it was a noble calling. And that was the moralistic political culture. And then you had a traditionalistic political culture, which comes mainly out of the gentry and the Tidewater gentry of the South, where the idea was that you were supposed to defer to your social betters. Now, one of the things that I ask people is which of those really have impacted Texas the most? And it's obviously the individualistic political culture and the the traditionalistic political culture, not the moralistic. The moralistic political culture you find mainly in New England. And I like to trace that back to settlement patterns. In Texas, when you came to Texas to settle, you homesteaded, right? They said, okay, I want to start my own farm. They'd give you 160 acres, which is a quarter of a square mile. And you were out there on your own, right? You didn't expect government to help you out. It was you versus just everybody else. Well, if you look at New England, it wasn't the case, right? In the New England area, everybody was together and they were in for the common good. And that's where you create that moralistic political culture. So today, when you look at what the roles of government are and how it may differ from Texas to some place like Massachusetts, it goes a lot back to this idea of how we settled those areas. So let's talk about economics of these New England colonies. Why is it that the headright system didn't take root here? Well, one of the reasons was that the soil was very hard to till. It was very rocky. And I know some of you have been up in that Boston area and you go out into the smaller towns. One thing we have here is we have wooden fences. In these places, often they just have rocks as fences. They just took the rocks out of the ground and built sort of a fence, not a high fence, usually about 2 feet, maybe. And so in New England, it took roughly 2 months to clear 1 acre of land. That is my dog scratching on the door. So I'm going to let him out. Okay, there you go. It took about 2 months to clear 1 acre of land of all the rocks before you could really farm it. So imagine that, 2 months, 60 days to clear an acre. Now, if you want to know what an acre looks at, look at the place that on the corner of Sublet and Little Road, where they have a sign out you can rent that little land. That's about an acre. That would take you 2 months to clear all the rocks out. So if they were going to give you 50 acres, how long would that take to clear the rocks out? Not to mention the trees. Plus, the growing season was short in this area, obviously. So you couldn't grow the exotic crops that you saw in the South. Tobacco was not going to grow there, obviously, and later on, cotton's not going to grow there. So what did they grow? They grew some barley, they grew some wheat, they grew some oats. They had some cattle, some pigs, and that's about it. They had abundant forests, and those forests were converted to what really New England's known for, and that's shipbuilding. They're going to be fishermen, right? When you ever see commercials for fishing, it's usually going to be people on the New England coast because these were abundant fishing grounds, obviously. We talked about the last time that the cod was so very important that they actually still have the old wooden cod above the speaker's chair in yeah, they do grow some rye making whiskey, oddly enough. But the cod was so important, and it used to be that you could just get cod everywhere. Early Spanish sailors would say that they could just drop their bucket into the water and pull it up. That's why you get Cape Cod. Since then, we've overfished the cod. The British love their cod. It was the #1 part of fish and chips. And actually in the 1970s, there was a brief cod war, no one killed, between Britain and Iceland, oddly enough. Now, of course, the biggest thing, well, they're also going to get mackerel too, and they're going to get halibut just for the halibut. But whales were also plentiful. We know the whaling stories out of these New England colonies. Whales were great, right? Because one, they were good for whale oil. Now, we know what whale oil was used for. It was used for lights, right? Lanterns. It's not very efficient. It was used for lubrication of machines. And they were used for ambergris. Does anybody know what ambergris is used for off the top of your head? Waiting for a good answer.
Perfume.
Yes, perfume. Thank you. That's exactly right. Now that's hard to imagine, right? Because you wouldn't go home to your wife and say, "Honey, are you wearing whale number 5? That just doesn't play well." Yeah, but it was for perfume. And so eventually, by the way, they will decimate whale stocks, and eventually they will end up having to go, way over next to the Galapagos Islands to go whaling. So they would take literally months and months before you'd ever come back home. But the fishing industry spurred the development of shipbuilding, obviously. And this means that they're going to be in more contact with the rest of the Atlantic. They're going to be traders, really. They're going to trade with goods from all around the world. Now, America will be part of what they call the Great North Atlantic Commercial Network. And that means we're going to be trading primarily with Great Britain and the West Indies, but we're also going to trade illegally with Spain, France, Holland, Portugal, and anybody else. One of the things I'm going to tell you about Americans early on is that they are tax cheats and they're smugglers when it comes to the British. And that's because at this time, we have what we call the mercantile system in effect. Now, the basic idea of mercantilism, and I'm summing it up in a very simple form, was that the net worth of the world was fixed. And you could measure that worth by gold and silver. That's what you measured it by. There was no other capital in the world but those things. Now we know that's different today. Obviously, we don't measure net worth by gold and silver, but they did. Now, your goal under mercantilism was to win against other countries. And how did you win against other countries? By exporting more than you imported. That means that you got more of the gold than everybody else, right? And so you would form colonies, and the colonies had a twofold purpose. One, they were going to be a source of raw materials so that you can manufacture finished goods. And it's always interesting. I ask students, what's more valuable, a manufactured good or a raw material? They tend to think raw material. No, it's a finished good, because as we quoted a little bit of Marx here, that your labor puts in what we call surplus value, right? If I give you a log, it's not worth a much. But if you take your skill and take that log and make it into a chair, it becomes valuable. So the colonies were going to be a source of raw materials, and there were going to be a market for their finished goods. So the Americas would supply Great Britain with the raw materials to make manufactured goods, and the Americans were supposed to buy those manufactured goods. Of course, this is always going to leave the colonies in a period of a trade deficit, right? Because they are going to be spending more money for the manufactured goods than they make for their raw materials. So the other thing you don't want happening here is you don't want your colonies trading with other countries, because that means that gold and silver is going to France, it's going to Spain, it's going to Portugal. You want to have laws that says you can only trade with us, right? That's the idea. So New England, when you look at New England, they don't have cotton or tobacco to trade with Britain. And so what can they trade? Britain was taxing other things, fish, flour, and wheat, and meat, mainly because they wanted to protect their own industries. But they left the door open to timber, fur, and whale oil. They didn't have those industries. So Americans will start using these laws to their advantage by building their own ships so they can avoid the taxes and smuggle around them. And they'll become part of what we call this vast trading networks. And you've heard of this before, and I'm going to pull this up real quick on the map. Right here is what we call the triangle trade, right? They get involved in the triangle trade. And there's a lot of different versions of triangle trade. You know, one of the ones that you're probably most familiar with is that the Bostonians right here will primarily take rum, some gunpowder, some iron, what they could find, some linen cloth, down to Africa, where they would sell that. They would, or trade it, of course, for slaves. And then what they would do is they would take these enslaved people back and primarily sell them to the West Indies. And from the West Indies, they would get some profit from the sale of those slaves, but they would use that profit to buy molasses and sugar. Now, you buy molasses and sugar to bring back primarily so that you can make more rum and begin the process of the trade again. This is important primarily because if you go back, and when we get to the future of the slave debate of enslaving people, and Northerners are saying, you know, how dare you Southerners to own slaves? It's immoral. Well, the Southerners' answer to that is, well, where did we get the slaves? Who made their money off the slave trade? And that was, of course, the New Englanders, right? Harvard, all these places were built on the slave trade. And it's very true. New Englanders might object to owning slaves, but they didn't mind trading in them. So there is a hypocrisy here that we're seeing among the New Englanders, obviously. Well, the effect of all this trading leaves the Americans always in short of hard currency. They don't have a lot of gold and silver. So what they're going to have to do is they're going to issue what they call bills of credit, saying that we'll promise to pay you later, these little pieces of paper. It's the origin of the phrase, the dollar bill, right? That's what the bill comes from. Now, so that's economics. Let's move on to religion and the Puritans. So today, when you and I, oops, somebody popping up here in my chat. Actually, the Matt doesn't, amidst the trade in guns and manufactured goods to Africa, there were some. Yeah, in fact, my map, I think my map does have that, Anthony. We'll just pop back over here. You'll see down here, it says gunpowder, tools, cloth. It's a briefer version of it, but yeah, there were things that they would try to send the other way too. It's a simplistic map, no doubt about it, and it's much more complicated. The Americans by the way, didn't have a lot of ways to make guns. They weren't very efficient at it, but they did import some guns from Great Britain. So when we go back to the Puritans and the Salem witch trials, when we think Puritans today, you know, we think Puritans as these strict people with, you know, strict morals. They didn't believe in fun. They didn't believe in any of that, right? No fun at all. That's what we think. That's not true. Puritans weren't hostile to all pleasures. I mean, the upper class Puritans, they loved to dance. They didn't wear just black and white, as we often think of Puritans. They would wear colorful clothes, but as you know, getting color into clothes made them more expensive, and they drank rum. They didn't have a problem with alcohol, again, because what else would you drink at the time? You certainly didn't drink the water. Now, they believed that alcohol was really sort of in itself a good creature of God. But if you drank too much, they would make you wear a big letter D, obviously for drunkard, just like you could wear the scarlet A for being an adulteress. They believed in moderation. And they weren't prudes. We often think of Puritans as being very prudish people. They weren't. They were very open to the idea about sex, right? You could be expelled from the church if you did not satisfy your spouse's sexual needs. Now, I don't know how you bring that up in church. It beats me. But you can understand the reasoning why here is because women's primary role was to produce children so that the colony could thrive, right? And so if they weren't getting that satisfied, they weren't reproducing, you weren't doing your bit for the colony. And they felt that if you did not have these kind of, how do I phrase this, activities, that's good, you would become bestial, right? And there were accusations of that. They put people on trial for that sort of stuff. I'm not sure. And usually they would execute the man and whatever animal that he happened to be with. Strange times in the Puritan days. There was a lot of adultery too. shockingly, because there was a shortage of women in the colonies. And of course, if somebody was caught with adultery, they blamed the woman, right? But we're going to see social tensions develop in the Puritan communities, partly out of issues of poverty, partly out of issues of disparity of wealth, availability of land, and partly because the Puritans were, very strict and persecuted people like Baptists and Quakers. They enjoyed that. Which brings us to this interesting topic, because it's a real interesting topic in terms of how we deal with history, and that's the Salem witch trials. Now, it happens in New England. 300 New Englanders are accused of witchcraft. And these were mainly lower class, middle-aged, marginal women. Now, they didn't burn witches. They hanged them. More than 30 are hanged, right? And believe it or not, these witch trials are opposed by some of the higher up in the clergy. They think, because the idea of witchcraft had been dying out in Western Europe, and now here they are going with this witch story. Now, simply put, it starts when some teenage girls listen to some voodoo stories by a West Indian slave. Town doctor says they're bewitched. The town panics. Well, they end up, like I said, hanging 30 people. Within the first 10 months, they hang 19 people. And eventually it gets out of control. So let me bring this up as a historical event that needs to be studied. When people tell you again, well, history should just be the facts. Okay, if I just tell you the facts, that 19 people were hanged and one man, and I've got a picture of him here. Let me pull him up. Stubborn Giles Corey, who was 81 and wouldn't admit that he was a witch. They laid him down and then just put a bunch of rocks on him. It was being pressed to death by stones that would kill you. So I guess he had a pressing engagement. Okay, sorry, but he's been dead for a long time. If we were to say that they killed this many people and that was it, that doesn't tell us a whole lot. So why do we have this witch craze? Why are people being accused of being witches? Hang on, let's see if somebody's got an answer for me. Oh, I got ha ha ha. Why were they being accused of witches? Well, there's a lot of theories about this, and a lot of people have written books about it. At one point, some people thought, well, it was because the weed had been tainted with a fungus that approximated LSD, and I think that's been fairly dismissed. But another lady out of Cornell wrote a book saying that it was a revenge, really, for a failed mission, military mission into Maine, and people wanted to hold people accountable for that. But there's another book, and it's called The Devil in the Shape of a Woman. And that author argues that really what it was that these women primarily that were accused of witchcraft either were outspoken in their community. They were outspoken women and who'd caused trouble. And so they were going to punish them that way. Some of the women were actually landowners, and they go, here's a way to get rid of that person so I can get that land, right? Some were midwives that people wanted revenge over a failed birthing. And so there is this idea that it's used for revenge. And if you've read or watched Arthur Miller's The Crucible, which is a story about the Salem witch trials, that is the modern day version of a more modern day version of a witch trial, which was the McCarthy hearings, right? Where everybody was accusing everybody of being a communist as a way to get revenge. Interesting idea, right? So that's one theory. Another theory is more of a Marxist theory, which argues that it was a class conflict between the rural Puritans and the wealthier urban Puritans who lived in the seaports. And so there's all these ideas of where the witch trials came from, why they happened. And so just saying that tell us the facts doesn't tell us a whole lot. And so examining what the possibilities were for the witch trials and what were the social strains of it, it's fascinating stuff. Now, the colonial leaders started thinking, oh my God, this is getting out of hand, because somebody accuses the governor's wife of being a witch. And so he goes, wait, whoa, my wife may be a lot of things, but she's not a witch. And so he orders everybody else released from jail. But by then, so many people have died. If you go to Salem today, Salem is really a witch town now. It's that there's a lot of stores selling witchcraft stuff, and they have a lot of haunted houses. And on Halloween, it's the place to be. And they have a memorial to all the people that died in the witch trials, interestingly enough. Well, we've talked about religion. We've talked about economics. Let's talk briefly about education. Obviously, education is important here. We talked about that every town had to have a public school so that the men could read the Bible. And of course, this area is home to our first ever college. That is, of course, Harvard University. I know some of you may have been to Harvard and looked around. You can go to the Three Lies statue where people touch the foot for good luck. It's supposedly John Harvard. It's not. Said he founded Harvard University. He did not, and has the wrong date of the founding on it. So don't trust statues either. So let's talk about the middle colonies real quick. And when we talk about the middle colonies, here we are talking about the middle colonies. We're talking about Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York. And I'm not going to say a lot about the middle colonies. So if you're a Delawarean, let's just go with that. Don't be offended. Or if you're a Pennsylvanian, don't worry, we'll come back to you in later things, the same way with New York. Here, it's going to be a mix. Economically, it's a mix. They take a little bit from Southern and New England colonies. They have the same crops as New England, but they can grow more of them. In fact, they'll be shipping a lot of their grain to the South, right? Because the South would rather use their land for growing these staple crops, and so they'll import food. The South at times cannot even feed itself. They'll send some of that surplus to the West Indies as well. Their rivers will give them access to fur trade. Remember that we talked about the Dutch being interested in the fur trade, and so they're doing a lot of commerce there. Their land policies are also mixed. Some places they use the headright system, and in other places they will have large mannered estates. Education, it's going to be mainly in the form of trade schools, thanks to people like Ben Franklin. And it's going to be an ethnic mix, right? You're going to have all sorts of different people here. You're going to have the Dutch, you're going to have the Swedes, you're going to have the Finns, you're going to have the Germans, you're going to have the Scotch-Irish, you're going to have the Irish. So it's a very diverse group of people. And the religion is also going to be mixed. It's in some places you're going to have churches. Out in Western Pennsylvania, where it's pretty wild, not a lot of churches. You'll have a minister who's a circuit rider who will ride the circuit and go around and preach at times for everybody. All right. So now that we've talked about these different colonies, let's talk about colonial cities really quick, because cities, as you might guess, are near and dear to my heart. The cities that are going to grow the fastest, and this is going to be true throughout American history, are those that are going to be on ports or near bodies of water because of commerce, right? So the biggest city in the colonies at the time was Philadelphia, 30,000 people. I mean, imagine that. Imagine going to a Cowboy game, there's only 30,000 people there. It was the second largest city in the British Empire behind London. New York had 25,000 people. Boston, 16,000 people. Charleston, 12,000 people. Newport, Rhode Island, 11,000 people. These were the big metropolitan areas. Now, again, as I say, we'll talk about this a little bit later when we start talking about industrialization. Think about the cities that grow there. Cleveland, St. Louis, right? Detroit, all on Chicago, all on bodies of water, right? Actually, I believe Dallas is the largest city in the country that's not on a major river waterway. And by the way, the Trinity does not count. Now, the upper class in a city at this time were going to be the merchants, the businessmen, obviously. The middle class were going to be the craftsmen, the innkeepers. And then the bottom class were the sailors, the unskilled workers, probably college professors, you know, and the artisans. Well, immediately you get a lot of people together. That means cities have to pass laws. I know that shocks to some of my libertarian friends, But they decide we need to have paved streets. Mud isn't going to cut it anymore. And so if you go to Philadelphia, you still see some of those old brick streets existing. But they had those early paved streets. You needed street lighting. In fact, Philadelphia, again, one of the first cities in America to have street lighting, to have the city lit up at night. Then you also had to have traffic laws. Now, I'm not sure, I haven't done a lot of investigation of traffic laws, but I'm pretty sure they weren't having speed traps where people were going 3 miles an hour in a 2 mile an hour zone. But they had to have ways that streets had to go a particular way. There were certain things you were not allowed to pull through the street, so on. Of course, you had to pick up garbage. What are you going to do about that? Fires, you had to have building codes. That was important because you just couldn't have just any building anywhere, because if one building burned, the rest of them burned. And then you needed a fire department as well as police. Interestingly enough, early fire departments were, everybody was supposed to have a bucket. And when there was a fire bell rang, you ran out with your bucket and you lined up with everybody, and you would be passing these buckets back and forth with water, and then to try to put out the fire. Now, if you were rich, you could really trick out your bucket. And if you go to Boston today and you go into the museum that's in the Customs House, or the State House as it's now called, right outside where the Boston Massacre took place, you can see some of these really fancy buckets that people would have, which seems a bit beyond the pale because it's a bucket. See how that works? Never mind. And then, of course, you needed relief supplies for the poor, right? You had to have at least relief supplies. How did you deal with poor people back then? You had them, right? How did you deal with criminals back then? These are questions that we'll bring up a little bit later. And then if you had to communicate between cities, you can imagine how hard that was. There were no paved roads outside the city. We're not going to get our first sort of paved road until we get to the Lancaster Turnpike around 1796, and that was just mainly gravel. Most of your travel was by foot or horse, right? There really were no post offices at first. What you did was, if you were living in Boston and you had a relative in New York, and you wanted to get a letter to him, you'd find a ship captain who was going to New York and give him the letter and give him some money to make sure it got there. That's what you did. Now, Ben Franklin's going to start an early post office and be its first postmaster general. And then you'll need newspapers. You'll need lots of newspapers, and you'll have more newspapers back then than you do today. In Philadelphia, you'll have almost 22 newspapers in one town. That's amazing. Absolutely amazing. So as we can see things in the colonies developing here, let's go back over to Europe and talk about the Enlightenment. I love talking about the Enlightenment. And let me pull this up real quick as we move to the Enlightenment. Here we go, as we get started on the Enlightenment. And the reason I like the Enlightenment so much is, and I know that Anthony and I have talked about this, is that when people will say something, well, we've always done it this way, the basic idea of the Enlightenment is not to give that answer, right? It's not to say, we've always done it this way, let's keep doing it this way. It's the idea of a scientific revolution on how we deal with knowledge. And so the Enlightenment is when Europe experiences a scientific revolution. Now it begins with this guy here, Nicholas Copernicus, a Polish astronomer. Now, he's not the first person to come up with this idea, but he's the one that really sort of sets it in motion in Europe and gets it really back on track. And that is that he comes with the idea of a heliocentric universe versus a geocentric universe. I like saying that because it makes me sound smart, even though I'm not. As you can imagine, helio meant around the sun, and geocentric meant around the earth. For a lot of people in Europe, at least, other civilizations have figured this out, but a lot of people in Europe felt that that the universe traveled around the earth, that it revolved around the earth. Nowadays, we know that teenagers think the universe revolves around them. Little joke, teenagers, just kidding. But, you know, they would think, well, I can prove that, right? Because if you look up in the sky, you don't look like you're moving, but the stars are. that's how they would think it, right? And so, again, yes, helo equals sun. Excellent. That's an idea of that when you just look at something and you don't know a lot about it, you come to a conclusion that may not be actually true, right? So he says, no, really, we all travel around the sun. Now, we also know that the sun also travels around the universe, the galaxy, and the galaxy is traveling around. We're just speeding all over the place. But the real guy that moves this along, and we all know him, and this guy right here, Isaac Newton, inventor of the fig Newton. No, I just made that part up. He did not invent the fig Newton. This is the peak of the scientific revolution when Newton hits on his theory of gravity. We all know this, and probably the story of him sitting under the apple tree and the apple hitting him on the head is apocryphal. No. His idea is that the universe moved in accordance with certain natural laws, which could be grasped by human reason and then explained by mathematics, right? This is the basics of really of astrophysics and quantum mechanics, you name it. So, and he comes up with all these natural laws, right? For every action, there's an opposite, an equal reaction, right? A lot of you know this. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it. It's an amazing idea. Well, as you can guess, much like any science, there are people who are going to say that, hey, if that applies to the physical world, can it apply to other worlds? So in other words, could one reason that natural law not only existed in the universe and with gravity, but also existed in things like politics, economics, and society, and that reason could make us aware of these laws? And so they felt that if we could understand the laws of politics, the laws of economics, the laws of society, we'd eventually create the perfect society, because somehow there was this perfect society out there, if only we could understand the laws. Now, you're thinking, well, how does this fill in with Christian beliefs? Well, Newton was a very devout Christian. If you read his diary, he goes swimming on a Sunday and he's just feeling god awful, no pun intended, god awful about it, because it's supposed to be a day of rest and he went swimming. Or he worked on a project on a Sunday and he feels like he sinned because that wasn't the day he should be doing that. So the Enlightenment could be reconciled with Christian beliefs, because for Copernicus and Newton, it showed the glory of God, right? That God was so amazing that he created all these laws to run this universe. It was a testament to the glory of God. And Puritans accepted Newtonian science from the beginning. They said, yes, this makes sense to us. It shows that God is all-knowing. Now, I'm going to jump a little bit ahead here until 1920. That's way ahead. When a man named Heisenberg came up with this idea of Heisenberg principles, and Albert Einstein came up with his relativity principles. You can go read those things and see that those will also be taken and applied to society. People will take them and apply them to the idea of society. Are all things relative, right? Can we really measure anything in our society? Now, there's a group of people that will take this to the extreme. They said that well, their name are the deists. The deists believe in God being a clockmaker. Now, you might find that alarming, and that may tick you off, and you may get wound up. But if you take it at face value, you might give me a second chance. Look at all those puns right in a row about clocks. Amazing. So if you think about somebody who made a clock back in the day, right? You put the clock together, you wind it up, and then you sit back and you watch it. That's all you do. You don't interfere with it. You're not messing with the clock. You let it go. And so the deists believed that God was the clockmaker, that he set all these laws into motion and then sat back and watched it go. And so they would believe that God did not interfere in human affairs if he's the clockmaker. So if you take that to that following extreme, if you think about Jesus, right, they would argue Jesus is not the Son of God because God does not interfere with the day-to-day life of human beings. They would believe that Jesus was a great prophet, and that was about it. And there are some famous deists, right? They're not bad people. There's Thomas Jefferson, Tom Paine, Ben Franklin. They're all deists. Not bad people. So in fact, you might say they're bueno deists. Anybody? No? Okay, shutting up and moving on. Now, this natural law theory is also going to take hold with John Locke. And I can't remember if I talked about John Locke in this class or in my history class. John Locke, who writes during the Glorious Revolution in 1688 and the 1690s, he said that if there's natural law, that means that people must have what we call natural rights. And Locke argues that these natural rights are life, liberty, and property. That's what he says. And that these rights were inalienable because they were given to you by your creator, right? They were given to you by God. Well, I think I have a picture of John Locke. I should move that ahead. He does not look good here. That's exactly how I look when I wake up in the morning. And so his argument is that there's no such thing as divine right of kings because of these natural rights, and that whenever you had a bad ruler, your job was to get rid of that ruler. That's what your job was to do, strangely enough. Now, if we go back and look at John Locke. Here's John Locke, right? He's coming up with this idea in 1688, 1690s, and he's saying that all men are endowed with certain natural rights, and among these are life, liberty, and property. We could say pursuit of happiness, and that government was created to protect these rights. And when government fails to protect these rights, then it's the right of the people to alter or abolish that government, right? If I'm saying that, it sounds like I'm quoting from, obviously, the Declaration of Independence. That's because John Locke is all about that declaration. Jefferson is, in fact, just quoting Locke almost verbatim. Now, he doesn't footnote, he doesn't have a bibliography page, because Jefferson is writing to people who will understand that's John Locke. That's the idea. So you can see the impact of Locke on the American Revolution eventually. So let's pop over to America and talk about the Enlightenment in America, which works really well in America. It's fabulous. And the reason it's fabulous in America is because it fits what we do over here, right? In the New World, people had thrown off old traditions. They had thrown off old traditions because what worked in England obviously didn't work here. That was the problem. And so we had to try something new. And so a lot of the American experiment was through observation, experimentation, and learning to think anew. That's what they did. And nobody, but nobody epitomized this better than Ben Franklin. He was the man of the Enlightenment. And when he goes to France, they see him as the new man emerging from the new world. Now, he's born in 1706 in Boston. I'm going to give you some brief background. He's the son of a candle maker and a soap maker, so he could wax poetic without getting dirty. That's pretty wicked. Okay, no more Ben Franklin puns. He was one of 10 children. Wow, that's a lot of children. So really, he's not going to have a lot of future because he's not the oldest. He's not really a commoner because he's so bright, but he never loses his common touch. So what they did with his brother, what they did with Ben Franklin, they said, you're going to go with your brother and you're going to become an apprentice printer. And that means you're pretty much an indentured servant to your brother as a printer. Now, he was much smarter than his brother. His brother didn't treat him very well, often beat him. And Franklin found the job boring, the jobs that he was assigned. So Franklin decided that he would write letters to his brother's paper under pseudonyms like Silas Do-Gooder and another woman named Sarah Goodwife, obviously not real names. And they'd be funny stories, or they'd be pearls of wisdom, like, guests are like fish, both stink after 3 days, things like that. And people enjoyed them. And so it made the paper very popular, and nobody knew who it was. And finally, when he told his brother, it's me, his brother punishes him, right? How dare you do that? So Franklin breaks his apprenticeship, which was illegal, and flees to Philadelphia at the age of 17. And by the age of 24, he owned his own print shop, and he published his own newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette. At the age of 27, he's publishing Poor Richard's Almanac. You know it. A penny saved is a penny earned. You know, going to bed early makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise, right? That one. And at age 42, he's able to retire. Wow, that's pretty amazing. He's done a lot more by the age of 42 than I had done by the age of 58. Now, before he retired, he founded the first lending library in the United States. He helped start the University of Pennsylvania, go him. And he started the American Philosophical Society, which is still in existence today. But he wanted to study the natural philosophies, what we would call science today. And you best know him for, in terms of scientific stuff, is the lightning rod, right? The lightning rod was what was important at the time. It was a way of protecting your home. But again, it was not without controversy, as we said before. You could take your lightning rod and stop lightning from hitting your house and burning it down. Well, for Puritans, right, the idea of lightning hitting your house was God's judgment against you. So how dare you try to take a lightning rod and thwart God's judgment? And so Franklin had answered this by saying that, well, look, if I'm thwarting God's judgment, why did he give me the brain to be able to think up this invention? That's a good counterpoint. Now, he also invented bifocals. For those of you who are bifocals, way to go, Ben Franklin. He also created the Franklin stove. This is a copy of the Franklin stove here, which reduced reduced fires and helped keep people warm. And by the way, he wouldn't patent it, so anybody could build it and have access to it. Wow, that's pretty amazing. And he created this. Now, this is a strange looking object, obviously. Some of you will recognize it, hopefully. This is known as the glass harmonica. It works like if you've ever watched people take a set of crystal glasses and fill them at different levels, and then they wet their fingers and they move their fingers around it and make different noises. Franklin made this into a turning wheel right here, and you had different thicknesses of lead crystal. And you would pump that with your foot and make this turn around, and with your wet finger, you could touch the different areas and make music. Beethoven, Mozart, or Beethoven composed for the glass harmonica. That's pretty impressive. And so did Mozart. They both liked that sound. Now, briefly, the glass harmonica goes out of favor. Okay, so now this is a tough question for you. Does anybody know why the glass harmonica goes out of favor? I'll give you a clue. They felt that people who played the glass harmonica would go insane. Any reason why they think that? Come on. Oh, I've got a chat person. Let's see what they say. That's right, Isabella, lead. Exactly. They were lead crystals, and there's a theory that by constantly playing it, you were getting lead poisoning that led you to be erratic. Strange enough, right? That's similar to, there is some thought of the Mad Hatter coming from the fact that they used to block hats with mercury, and mercury poison can lead to erratic behavior. Interesting that was the case. But people still play the glass harmonica today, and you can watch them. So that's the Enlightenment. Well, sort of to quote Isaac Newton, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So for every movement, a lot of times you'll see a backlash movement. And that backlash movement that we see in the United States against the Enlightenment and the rise of deism is what we call the Great Awakening, or what I experienced about 7 o'clock this morning. Or actually every morning at my age. What starts the Great Awakening, there's a lot of theories on this, is that a lot of the educated classes were drifting off into deism, right? Away from Christianity and into deism, which is an interesting concept. And there was this also thought that people were getting too devoted to materialism, the worries of the material world, and not so concerned about what's going to happen in the next world. So again, if you think people have lost their way today religiously, they were thinking this back in 1740. Well, the beginnings really start, and I'm going to show you a picture of him a little bit later, with a guy named Jonathan Edwards. Now, Edwards was a Congregationalist minister in Northampton, Massachusetts. And I'll give you a little background. I keep wanting to say this is not going to be on the test. I don't know why I keep wanting to say that. In 1716, he entered Yale at the age of 13. Now, keep in mind, Yale is not the Yale of today. Yale is primarily a divinity school. That's what it is. Yeah, what use is a soul? Good point. So, especially if you're in politics. And he graduated valedictorian 4 years later. Now, keep this in mind too. Graduating valedictorian is not what it is today. In many cases, your school ranking was often based on your social status, right? So we'll see later that Jonathan Sewell ranks higher than John Adams, even though John Adams has a lot better grades. While in college, as training for a minister, he obviously becomes very spiritual. He marries Sarah Pierpoint, the daughter of a very prominent minister. They have 11 children, so he's clearly very spiritual about something. And what's amazing about this is that all 11 survive. I mean, that was rare, right? You expect to lose a few, but all 11 survive. Edwards was known to be very witty, very charismatic. And so when he's worried that his congregation is not thinking about the afterworld, the afterlife, just what's going on now, he tries to frighten them with visions of H-E-L-L. I don't cuss, I'm sorry. I won't say that word either. By 1735, he said, okay, I think I've got everybody back to normal. They're focused on what's waiting for them afterwards in this afterlife. But the true catalyst of the Great Awakening is this guy. He really gets it going. And that's George Whitefield. Now, George Whitefield came from England. And he's a unique character because if you were to go back into the English days of sermons, your minister sat there just like in the Puritan days, and you sat quietly and they read from a text, right? And they sat there and just went on a bit droning on, right? You didn't want to fall asleep because you get punished for that. But it was a very boring, straightforward lecture, just a talking head. Whitefield decided that he was going to change all of that. And so what he did was he decided, one, he'll memorize his sermons. Woohoo, right? And two, he was going to rehearse his sermons. He would rehearse them in front of a mirror, and he would bring elements of the stage of acting to his lecture, his sermon, I guess is a better way of saying that. And so he would be very animated when he would speak, and would get people all riled up and fired up at these sermons that he would hold. And he believed that he was called to do this because he felt that congregations had become lifeless. They were lifeless because, according to him, he said that dead men preached to them, and too many ministers, and I'm quoting him here, were slothful shepherds and dumb dogs. Ew. Okay, that's not very nice. Now, what he would do is, and he's a master of this, before he appeared in a town, he'd have somebody right up ahead of him and they'd put up posters to go, here he comes, he's coming to speak, you need to go see this guy. Somebody just called me a witch. And he would attract huge crowds. And his audiences would be enthralled by this style of preaching that they'd never seen before. You know, a lot of times he would just get on a stump. And of course, remember, you would have no microphones. And in some places, he would preach to crowds of 6,000 people. 6,000, no microphones, on a log. And so since he's using this dramatic acting, he would impersonate the agonies of burning in the pit of fire in front of people and really scare them, but also then entertain them. Now, Ben Franklin went to watch him in Philadelphia, and Franklin's this skeptic, right? He's a deist and whatever. And he goes, "Oh yeah, whatever." And he went, and he was so moved by all this that and when the collection plate came around, he emptied his pockets. He eventually became friends with Whitefield, and helped start a place where people like Whitefield could speak. And the reason for that is that the more established clergy did not like George Whitefield. They hated him. In fact, as you can see from this picture that I have of him, you can tell one thing about him, right? He did have a deformity. He's cross-eyed, right? And they would make fun of him for being cross-eyed. Well, his supporters will say, no, 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 no. He's not cross-eyed, but his eyes make the sign of the cross, would be their response. And then they would talk about his, his birth. He was born in an inn, and they go, "Oh, he was born in an inn." And they go, "Well, Jesus, was born in a manger because they wouldn't even let him in the inn," right? So they always had this response to Whitefield. Now, Whitefield, by the way, I didn't get his thing up here. Whitefield's grave, by the way, when he eventually dies in America, becomes sort of a pilgrimage site where he was buried, and soldiers would take pieces off the corpse to take with them into battle as some sort of sacred relic. And so there wasn't a whole lot left of Whitefield after he died, but a very popular one. Well, the Great Awakening hits its real peak with Jonathan Edwards, because Edwards went and saw George Whitefield and just cries his eyes out. He is so moved by Whitefield. And he goes, "Okay, Whitefield's got everybody fired up and they're all ready to embrace religion again." And so he goes, "I'm going to spark my own revival." And so in 1741, Edwards gives one of the most famous sermons in American history, incredibly famous, in Enfield, Massachusetts. And we all know this sermon. It's "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." Okay. Now I'm going to quote a little bit of this. It's about a 45-minute sermon. Give me a little bit, but it can give you a feeling of what he's trying to say. And I'm going to quote here. He said, "The bow of God's wrath is bent and the arrow made ready on the string, and justice bends at the arrow at your heart. And it's nothing but the mere pleasure of God, and that of an angry God, without any promise or obligation at all, that keeps the arrow one moment being drunk with your blood." Right? So in other words, God's got this arrow and he's aimed at your heart and he's going to shoot it, and there's nothing going to stop him. And he says that God holds you over the pit of Hell as much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over this fire. He abhors you, is dreadfully provoked with you. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast in the fire. So God is mad. God is very angry with all of you. And he's angry because you're all sinners. That's right. I'm talking to you, Lori. I'm talking to you, Anthony. I'm talking to you, Isabella. All of you. You're all sinners. Not me. I'm not. But I'm a politician. There's a special place down there for me. And so he's saying that you've all sinned, and your only hope was to repent. Now, he does it a little bit different than Whitefield. He's using a calm and logical voice. He's not trying to, but even in this calm, logical voice, he's scaring people to death. Not literally scaring them to death, but this sermon is reprinted all across America. Now, it was successful in getting people back to churches. Between 1740 and 1742, 50,000 New Englanders joined churches when there's not a lot of people. That's a massive number of people coming to this Great Awakening. So you think about this, right? Now, religion changes just like anything else. Today, when you go to a church, are they talking to you about the angry God, right? Are they saying, "God's angry. He's so angry with all of you. You terrible people." No. Starting in the late 1800s, and we'll eventually get to this when we talk about Victorian religion, we changed the view of God, right? Now it's a loving God. No more this sinners in the hands of an angry God, but a forgiving God, a compassionate God, right? It changes. So for him, he's very effective at this, maybe too effective. He eventually gives a sermon somewhere, and one guy, after hearing the sermon, goes and kills himself, and he's dismissed from his congregation. Wow. So maybe you could try to dress up as Jonathan Edwards. I think I've seen Jonathan Edwards' greats. I go to a lot of people's greats. Well, so what happens is, okay, so you get 50,000 people join up. And one of the things that people like George Whitefield was saying was to use your own judgment and this idea of individual salvation. And so using your own judgment means people are going to think for themselves. Well, if there are more churches, that means you're going to need more preachers, which means you're going to need more colleges to train preachers. Now, 3 already existed: Harvard in 1636, William and Mary in 1693, Yale in 1701. But because of the Great Awakening, we get the colleges of Princeton, Columbia, Brown, Rutgers, and Dartmouth. What you know as the Ivy League schools, except Cornell's an Ivy League school, but it's not founded until 1865. This Great Awakening permanently implanted in American culture the evangelical principles, right, of American religion. It weakened the old-fashioned clergy and encouraged believers to exercise your own judgment, which we see today. You see it today when, if you have a church and all of a sudden there's a disagreement at church, what does one group do? They go move and create their own church, right? This is going to lead to, and watch me do a little bit of rapping here. Hang on, get my rap down. A proliferation of denominations, thus a greater need for religious toleration across the nation. Boom, nailed it. In other words, we're going to start getting a lot of different denominations, which is historically American, right? And when we get to later on, when we talk about religion later on, there's a theory of secularization that pops up, that when you get into industrialization and with scientific revolutions, that people would move away from religion. And we've seen that secularization theory take root in Europe, right? Where only about 3% of British people actually go to church on a regular basis. But in America, because of our religious history and this ability to adapt our churches, has kept a fairly strong faith compared to other countries. Of industrialized Europe and the United States, America is the most religious, more religion than Italy in terms of believing in an afterlife and things of that nature. So that Great Awakening, that's going to be our first one. We're going to have a second one in a little bit, another Great Awakening. And then there are some theories out there that during the 1980s, we may have had a third Great Awakening during the Reagan administration, when you had the rise of the moral majority and an increase of church membership. Now, what we're going through today, who knows? We know that we see a decline in church membership, mainly of young people. Not that they've become less religious, just more against organized religion. So we'll tackle that as well. Now, next week, we are going to lead ourselves up to the beginnings of the American Revolution. What causes the revolution? That's how fast we're moving right along. And so that's where we're going to leave off today. So I'd like to say thanks for everybody for showing up. I see some more people. Thank you all for being willing to chip in the chat. Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, Isabella. Everybody that chipped in. Feel free to always throw stuff out there. I try to read it and keep the lecture moving steadily. But I hope you enjoyed that lecture about a little bit about American religious history, which is really a fascinating topic to read on. It's so unique. And next week, we'll get to revolution. Revolution, finally. And we'll get to the French and Indian War. We have to go after the hated French. Sorry, Isabella. And then,
be nice.
Well, you know, it's the French and Indian War that's going to lead to the American Revolution, because the French are going to be wanting revenge against the British, and they're going to get it. So anyway, thanks everybody for coming. We'll do this again next Monday at 8 o'clock. So I really appreciate you showing up, and we'll talk later.
Thank you.
See you.